Hello. Today's share will be about the mitzvah of netilas yadayim, a mitzvah that's performed multiple times a day, involving entire procedure, sometimes with a bracha. So what's the purpose and meaning behind this mitzvah? And since it's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, there's not even a pasuk in the Tahara that explicitly states when, how, or why we wash our hands. So today we'll be exploring not necessarily all the myriad of details and halachas and intricacies of how the mitzvah netilas yadayim is performed, but the general background on a gashmis and ruchnius level of how this mitzvah came to be. So before I begin, I want to share a story from the Gemara, Eruvin, about Rabbi Akiva when he was imprisoned by the Romans, and his student Rabbi Yeshua Garsi would come daily to attend to his needs, and he would bring him food and water, we're assuming. And what we know is one day Rabbi Yeshua was accosted by the Roman guard who saw the amount of water that Rabbi Yeshua was carrying and decided that it was excessive and spilled some out on the ground, saying, "This is way too much water for one man to drink. Clearly, you're planning to soften the earth and burrow out of the prison and take your teacher to safety." He spilled the water out. And when Rabbi Yeshua brought Rabbi Akiva the minimal amount of water, Rabbi Akiva said, "Yeshua, you know I rely on you. How could you bring an old man like me such a little amount of water? There's not even enough for me to wash my hands." Rabbi Yeshua said, "Wash your hands? There's not even enough for you to drink." But Rabbi Akiva was resolute, and he said, "It is better for me to die on my own of thirst or hunger, because he wouldn't eat without washing his hands, than to die because I would be deserving of the death penalty for contradicting the words of my colleagues, the Chacham, who said that one may not eat until they wash netilas yadayim." And the Gemara concludes that Rabbi Akiva did not eat until Rabbi Yeshua somehow brought him water. And we learn from this that if Rabbi Akiva was so meticulous in keeping this mitzvah when he was old and imprisoned, how much more so when he was free to do so and younger and able to achieve this mitzvah with a plentiful amount of water. So this brings us to our question. When was this mitzvah of washing your hands before eating a meal, specifically a meal with bread, introduced, if Rabbi Akiva says this is something that my colleagues instituted? So a source in the Gemara is in Maseches Chulin, which brings us the clearest discussion about how the mitzvah of netilas yadayim came to be enforced. And it says that Shlomo HaMelech and his Beis Din were actually the first to decree that hands can make kodshim tameh. What does that mean? That somebody who touches kodshim, sacrifices food that was offered on the mizbeach and now is only permitted to kohanim to eat, if they were touched by someone whose hands were not washed, then that food would be tameh, would be disqualified from being eaten. So how does that come to be? Because the laws of Tumah and Tahara are very intricate and very detailed, and there's an entire seder of Mishnayos about it. But the basics from the Torah is that if someone becomes tameh, their entire body becomes tameh. There's no such thing as a foot being tameh or a piece of hair being tameh. A human is tameh in his entirety, and hands cannot just become tameh. So this was the gzeira of Shlomo HaMelech, that hands, which are so involved and busy, and the part of our body that's the most touching and exposed to all sorts of elements, the hands can become tameh, and very easily, and out of protection, out of just strictness and really honoring the kodshim that are brought on the mizbeach, the new law that was enacted was if that hands were to touch the kodshim, then the kodshim couldn't be eaten. And not just hands that were tameh, hands in general. So how would a kohen ever be able to eat kodshim? Would he have to wear gloves? So the answer is netilas yadayim was instituted by Shlomo HaMelech, that there's a special procedure for washing your hands out of a vessel 3 times or 2 times, or on the right and on the left, and a bracha said, because this is a commandment of the Chachamim, and the Torah says that anything that the Chachamim teach, we must follow. So we could say Asher Kedishana, that Hashem commanded us to wash our hands because it's something Chachamim taught us to do, and the Torah, so that almost makes it a mitzvah d'oraisa. Keeping what the Chachamim taught is following the commandment of Hashem. However, so far we've only been talking about Shlomo HaMelech and about kohanim who are going to eat karbanos. What about humans like us that are not kohanim? There's no mizbeach. We're not eating kodshim. So the Gemara in Shabbos describes that Shlomo HaMelech made this decree for Kodshim, but Hillel and Shammai made this decree also for Truma. That any food, so Truma is about 2% of a person's crop that they would bring to the Kohen as a donation. And before the Kohen could eat Truma, he also had to wash his hands, according to Hillel and Shammai's decree. And in that time, returning to the Maseches Chulin, there was another decree instituted that every day, regular people, not even Kohanim, eating everyday run-of-the-mill meals that are not even Truma, also have to wash their hands because of srach Truma. So srach Truma means, the word srach kind of means pulled after, tied into, because there is this decree that people eating Truma need to wash their hands, because if they were to touch it with bare hands, it would be considered like their hands are tamei. The Truma would become tamei, and it would need to be burnt. The Chacham wanted to get everyone used to this idea, make hand washing widespread, so there would never be a mistake that someone would ever come to eat Truma in a state of impurity, and therefore they made an enactment at the time of Hillel and Shammai, and it was actually their students who really spread it and made it more decisive. So near the end of the second Beis Hamikdash, that every commoner who wanted to participate, because not every person was living on this level of purity, but there were people called chaverim, which kind of means the members of this society that were trying to live their lives in the holiest way possible. They would eat their food, it's called chulin, food that's chol, it's regular, al taras hakodesh. Sorry, they would eat it al taras truma, on the level that you would eat truma. So Kodesh is even stricter level, which is another discussion, but they would eat it washing their hands before it as if they were eating truma. And interestingly, in Chassidus, there's an entire essay on netilas yadayim by the Tzemach Tzedek in Derech Mitzvah Secha called Mitzvahs Netilas Yadayim Masuda, and he explains that if this enactment was made at that certain time period in Jewish history, when it was near the end of the second Beis Hamikdash, it was because that was the time when this sort of tumah of the strength of this nation, which he doesn't specify which, but probably the Roman nation, and Rome is considered Edom, and we're considered that we're still under the sway of the Roman, of that Galus, of Galus Edom, which is Rome. That came more powerful that time, and that's why the Chacham need to respond by increasing in people's awareness and being careful about kedusha and Tahara, and that's why netilas yadayim before eating food was specifically introduced then. And this continued even after the Beis Hamikdash. But that's an interesting discussion, because nowadays there's no need to be careful to eat your chulin as if you were eating truma by washing your hands before it, because there's not any truma to be eaten. There's not even any kodshim. Kohanim still are careful with some laws of kedusha, like not entering a cemetery and being exposed to a dead body, but what's the point of us washing before we eat? And the answer is, maybe it's a zeicher lemikdash. Maybe we're still trying to make sure, like until this day, it's been many, many years, but we want to be completely regulated that we wash our hands before we eat, so that when Beis Hamikdash comes, it's not something that needs to be introduced. And it's this beautiful way of looking at netilas yadayim, that every time I'm doing this mitzvah, it's in hope that right now, Mir Hashem, the Beis Hamikdash should be rebuilt, and we should go back to having all these halachas. There is another element to add to it, however. There's one more Gemara that speaks about washing before the meal. And I want to interject and just explain what it means washing before a meal, washing before bread, when I was speaking that the Kohanim would wash before eating truma. So truma is something that comes from produce, and mainly the truma that was brought was actually wine made from grapes, oil made from olives, and flour made from grains. So actually, one wouldn't bring the kohen the raw grains, one would bring the kohen flour. So foods that incorporate flour, that's what we need to wash our hands before, in memory of people washing their hands before they touch truma, or chulin, as the case may be. So bread has flour. What about mazonos foods, also made out of flour? So that's not considered really a seuda kavua, like an actual meal. It's not a meal of consequence. So we only really wash our hands when it's a proper meal that it's noticed that we're eating, and that this is the procedure that we're going to wash our hands before. But for anything casual, there isn't any need to wash our hands. But if one were to eat a lot of cake, even though it's mazonos, if it were to be a meal of consequence and the whole meal were to be cake, then they would have to wash their hands. So going back to our days, where there is no truma and no concept of tumah and tahara to the same extent as there used to be, there's another Gemara that indicates the relevance of netilas yadayim to our lives, and that is in Brachos, Daf Nun Hey. On the source sheet, it's source 6, that Rav Yehuda said, that Rav said that there is a pasuk that says, V'his kadashtem, and you should be holy. Eilu mayim rishonim. These are the waters that you wash before a meal, the first waters. So we're adding another element to the mitzvah of netilas yadayim for a suda, which is being holy. So that's interesting, because we sometimes interchange the words Tahara and kedusha, but Tahara is a metaphysical state where, according to the laws decided by the Tahara and explained by the Chachamim, you cannot do certain things like enter the Beis HaMikdash, bring karbanos, touch certain things. You need to go to the mikveh before. That's Tahara. But kedusha is just a general sense of, in our lives, living at a standard that we're trying to be separate from, not necessarily things that are tameh, things that are defined and mandated by the Torah to be untouchable, but things that are just mundane and regular and physical. Kedusha is a level of dedicating yourself to Hashem. So when it comes to washing our hands for a meal, it's also somehow tied into kedusha. And there's entire discussion in a Tosfos and Pesachim. When it comes to the Pesach Seder, there's a commonly known halacha that we actually wash our hands before eating karpas, which is not bread. So that's an entire another discussion about why liquids are more susceptible to tumah. But because they are, there's a need, it's thought, to wash your hands before you touch a food that's dipped into liquid. And the common practice is that we don't actually say the bracha. As the Tosfos explains, these days we're not careful about tumah tahara, so we might be doing it as a zeicher, we might be doing it to remember that in times of the Beis HaMikdash, you had to wash your hands before touching something dipped into a liquid, just like you had to wash before bread or eating any sort of truma food, but we don't have to say the bracha. And Tosfos contrasts the food that was dipped into the liquid with bread. And they said that we wash for bread, mishum kedusha v'nekias. That the reason that we wash for bread, us nowadays, modern Jews, is because of holiness and cleanliness. So there's a lot to unpack there. Once upon a time, it might have been about tumah and tahara, but today there's an indication that's about kedusha. We're going to leave to the side this entire discussion about washing our hands before the meal and turn our attention to the other type of washing our hands, which is when we wake up. The question is, where does that come from? This has less of a grounding in halacha, less of a clear, explicit source in the Gemara that you must do netilas yadayim as soon as you wake up. What we are told in Gemara Brachos is that one of the preconditions before davening shacharis is that one should wash their hands, and not just wash rechitza, but netilat. They should wash their hands with the netilat, the vessel that you all know what it looks like, and it hasn't changed in 2,000 years. Even in the times of Bayis Sheni, they were using a round sort of container with two handles on the side. They've dug it up in archaeological digs. That is called a netilat. So when you use that vessel to wash in a specific way, that's called netilah. When you just wash your hands by dipping it in or by holding it under a sink, that's not netilas yadayim. That's something else entirely. So if that's a prerequisite for tefillah shacharis, why would that be the case? So the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel, who lived in Spain and was a Rishon, wants to argue that actually, before davening, there's no actual need to wash our hands as we wash our hands before eating bread, which is stemming all the way from the laws of tumah and tahara, so it has a very specific method that must be done. Rather, one should wash their hands before davening because one should have clean hands to daven, because we're speaking to Hashem, the King of the whole world, and we're just borrowing the language in netilah because it's similar that we wash our hands before bread, but it's not exactly the same. And the point is to be clean, and one could even wipe their hands on a towel. You don't actually need to wash with water. Now comes a very groundbreaking and famous shaila and tshuva from the Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Avraham ibn Aderes, a Rishon from Spain who wrote copious answers to Jews all over Europe and the Middle East. And he responded to someone who asked, what is the source for washing your hands in the morning? And not only just washing them before davening, but saying a bracha, that this is a mitzvah. And he analyzes it, and he says, if it were to be not just, but a requirement before tefillah, then wouldn't we also wash our hands with a bracha before mincha and ma'ariv? But that is not the practice. That is not the halacha. So clearly there's something connected to not just the fact that we're davening shacharis, but the fact that we are beginning our day, that we have just woken up. And the Rashba's words are that when a person wakes up, Hashem returned his neshama to him, and he's like a new creation. And as a bria chadasha, a new creation, he now has the power to serve Hashem. And now his entire day will be serving Hashem. Everything he does today, not just tefillah, but every action is part of his avodah of Hashem, and he is just like a kohen. And that is where we see that netilas yadayim, this mitzvah, actually parallels the mitzvah of the kohanim to wash their hands and feet before they started their daily service in the Beis HaMikdash under the kihar. Now, that wasn't necessarily for Tahara, because a kohen couldn't work in the Beis HaMikdash if he was tamei, and the way to negate tuhuma is to go to the mikvah, to fully immerse one's body. So how would washing his hands and feet contribute to his Tahara and his fitness to serve in the Beis HaMikdash? So the Ramban on Parshas Ki Sisa says that it's just a sign of respect and honor and cleanliness, that someone should be ready to serve the king. But clearly there's something deeper here, where we see that a human is serving Hashem every day, just like a kohen is serving Hashem in the Beis HaMikdash. And water comes into play. Washing your hands comes into play before these things begin. And that is the key reason, actually the main reason, that the Alter Rebbe brings in Shulchan Aruch Harav when he discusses in Siman Daled the mitzvah of washing our hands in the morning. He gives precedence to the Rashba's reason that we're a new being, we're serving Hashem, therefore we must wash our hands, not just for cleanliness so that we can daven, but in a ritual way, in a specific pattern, with a method. This sort of something that represents a greater meaning. There's a really interesting sefer called Shulchan Shel Arba by Rabbeinu Bachaye, who is not to be confused with the author of Chovos HaLevavos, but also a Rishon who lived in Spain, who writes a book dedicated to the laws of eating, the table for four. And each chapter is about something else to do with food. So the first chapter is about the halachas of eating, the halachas of brachos, and the second chapter is about intentions and kavanah while eating, and so on, until the last chapter, which is about the seudah that Hashem will make when Mashiach comes for all the tzaddikim. So in Shulchan Shel Arba, in the first section, which is about the halachas, he talks about the mitzvah of netilas yadayim. So Rabbeinu Bachaye is a Kabbalist, similar to the Ramban, and he references how the mitzvah of netilas yadayim, in the word netila, we have a hint to the core of this mitzvah, the deeper meaning behind it. What does netila mean? So there's all sorts of suggestions, and one is simply to take, because you're taking water, you're not just washing your hands, but you're actually using human effort to move the water over your hands. But there's a pasuk in Yeshaya that says, "V'yinat leim v'yinasem kol yemei olam," that you have lifted them up, because nasa means to lift, and v'yinat leim is a synonym. It means to raise. So the mitzvah of netilas yadayim raises us up, because it's so tied into this idea of kedusha. And kedusha is raising us, we're putting ourselves on a higher state of being. And there's something that a lot of Mefarshim say, that when you wash your hands, and it's mentioned in the Gemara as well, after you wash your hands, you should really be raising your fingers towards the heaven, because it says, Ve'esa v'nikayan kapai, and I will raise my hands in cleanliness. And then it says at the end of that pasuk, V'asoi v'va mizbechacha Hashem, and I will encircle your mizbeach Hashem. So we see that pasuk in Tehillim hints to one having clean hands before they circle the mizbeach, which is the mitzvah of avodah for the kohanim, and then our avodah shebalev, we serve Hashem through tefillah, and then we also have our entire day being avodah, as the Rashba brings up. So this pasuk hints to the idea that we need to be clean. Our hands need to be clean before we do any of those things. But there's a lot to think about. According to Kabbalah, the idea that you're raising your hands, and your hands have 10 fingers, and 10 fingers represent the Esher Spheros. So what it means by you're being Mekadesh your hands is that you're actually drawing down from the 10 Spheros. And what Rabbeinu Bachaye is really Mekadesh, which is really fascinating, is that he now ties in the idea of the morning washing and the washing before bread. Because so far we said washing for bread only, or not only, but originates from washing your hands as a state of Tahara, and also there's a hint to the Gemara about kedusha. We don't know what that really means. And then washing your hands in the morning had to do with dedicating yourself to serving Hashem like a kohen. So it's not just going to be any random sort of cleaning your hands for davening, but some intentional type of washing your hands with a vessel, just like the kohanim washed with a vessel. It needs to resemble that. Seems to be two separate things so far. But if we could bring the washing before the meal and show that this is actually similar to washing in the morning, because the meal is a form of avodah as well. And that's what Rabbeinu Bachai says, that a shulchan nikra mizbeach. The shulchan is called the mizbeach in different sources. So your meal, and this is parallel in many sifrei machshava that speak about the importance of netilas yadayim before a meal, reminding you that the meal and your eating is not just for the sake of self-gratification, but it's the sake of using your meal and the energy that you derive from the food to serve Hashem based on that food, which is so basic and mundane and human bodily needs, but we could elevate it by not only saying a bracha and not only by eating kosher food, but beforehand actually taking a moment to wash our hands and dedicate the entire meal to Hashem as well. There may be those of you who are watching who are thinking, you missed out what is the most basic reason, seemingly, for doing netilas yadayim in the morning, the reason that's most often taught, and that is because when you sleep, your neshama leaves, a percentage of it, and then you're in a state of a 60th of death, and that means that a ruach tuma settles on you. Then when you wake up, that spirit of impurity departs, but it's left only in your fingernails. And that idea is drawn from the Zohar, and it's brought up in the Shulchan Aruch Harav, but more as a secondary reason. The primary reason is actually the one that I cited earlier from the Rashba. However, this idea from the Zohar, I think I see that it itself derives or is related to and linked to the idea in the Gemara that one needs to wash their hands before touching food because of Shivta. Shivta being the name of this Ruach Ra, as explained by Rashi and Mefarshim. There's a evil spirit of negativity that attaches to hands. And that's why your hands need to be clean before you use them throughout the day. And that's specifically why you need to wash them 3 times. That's associated with this banishing of this negative spirit. So the question is, what is the spirit? And what's the purpose of washing your hands to remove the spirit? And on that topic of discussion, there's a very interesting sicha in Sefer HaMaamarim Yiddish by the Frierdiker Rebbe. And that's actually one of the curriculums used by the Bat Sheva Learning Center in the high school chidon. So a lot of girls might have been already exposed to this mimer. And this mimer talks about the difference between washing our hands for a meal and washing our hands before our daily service of Hashem, aka washing our hands when one wakes up. And the core obvious difference is that in the morning netilah, we wash once on the right, once on the left, once on the right, once on the left. And before a meal, it's in consecutive 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. So the Frierdiker Rebbe defines this Ruach Ra, as it applies to us in our generation, that it's really the influence of klippos and just physicality and mundane desires and anything that covers up our core purpose in the world. And how does one banish this darkness? So that's by really pushing away and breaking down any of our misplaced desires and misplaced involvement. Because hands really signify involvement. They're the most prominent aspect of our body that is really interacting with physical objects. Yeah, the whole body has sense, but hands, touch is really the most sensitivity to things, to objects. And when we wash our hands once the right, once the left, and so on, we're doing it in this way of bit by bit, because that's how one breaks down the negative trays. By scrubbing a little here and pushing there and just fighting and struggling. It's not going to be a fluid motion. It really takes a struggle. However, when it comes to netilas yadayim before bread, netilas yadayim l'suda, we're no longer engaging with the negativity and fighting it. We're actually being mekadesh our teva, our nature, and our regulars and our habits and using them for Hashem. We're not trying to push them away now, we're trying to transform them. And that isn't in a method of fighting and breaking down, but that's in a method of fluidity and wholesomeness and incorporating all of it, everything we have to serve Hashem. And those are the messages of the two types of netilas yadayim. And even there's tons of messages in the whole format. I kept alluding to the fact that we know that netilas yadayim, whenever we wash our hands with a cup, that it's not just about cleanliness. Because if it was cleanliness, you just stick your hands under some running water. So it would be interesting to analyze all the aspects, the elements, and Rambam brings that there are 4 things that make a netilas yadayim valid, and that would be the cup, and the type of water in it, and the amount of water, and human effort, or some sort of mechanical effort involved in moving that water over you. So Chassidus is here to explain and add the meaning to all those elements of netilas yadayim. One that the Frierdiker Rebbe brings up is the idea that it has to be a cup, a vessel that has an inside, because we need to do it from a way of pnimius, a way from that has not just like external and superficial, but something that has internality to it as well. And there is also the idea of the water, which in Derech Mitzvah Tzemach Tzedek brings that water is clear and clarity, and it has no color of its own, and that really reflects the idea of bittul and being nullified to Hashem and being open to being transformed into whatever Hashem needs it to be, and that's why it can fight with the negativity of the tumah. And the other elements that a human needs to do it, because someone with da, someone with knowledge, someone with intention, and that it needs to be an amount of water because it's really going to do some sort of effect. And any time that we have to use physical objects for transforming the world, according to halacha, there's always some sort of measured amount. And that's how, even though it seems like we're just doing regular mundane things, what's the difference if I use 1 log or 2 login? Really, or revius halog, which is actually the minimum amount of water used for netilas yadayim. When it's a specified amount, it's that amount that is been given the power and imbued by halacha with the power of transformation. To bring this all together, we saw that netilas yadayim for shacharis has a primary reason of kedusha, a primary reason to dedicate yourself to serve Hashem throughout the day, and a secondary reason that in this generation actually got more emphasized of Tahara, of pushing away negativity and removing ourselves and fighting against our nature. And netilas yadayim before the meal, which had a primary reason of Tahara, because it started all the way back at the Beis HaMikdash to remind people to never touch truma or kodshin foods with unwashed hands. And netilas yadayim before a meal, whose primary reason was for Tahara, to ensure that people never touched kodshin or truma with unwashed hands, that they should wash their hands before eating anything. In our generation seems to be that our emphasis is on kedusha, as the Tosfos says, and as brought in other sources as well, that before we go to a meal, we want to be thinking that this meal is not just for self-indulgence, but another form of avodah. So that's just an interesting interpretation, and something I noticed when researching all the sources, that both types of netilas yadayim have both elements of Tahara and kedusha, but the focus might have shifted. And there's a sicha, and the Kutei Sichos Chelek Lamed Aleph about Kisisa that you should check out as well, that talks about why kedusha and Tahara, kedusha is the emphasis in our generation, but then the Frierdiker Rebbe's Ma'aver does talk about how we still engage in a level of Tahara that that netilas yadayim can bring for us. And finally, after the Gemara has many, many dire warnings about the consequences of someone who's mezalzel b'netilas yadayim, who disparages this mitzvah of netilas yadayim, there's also a wonderful assurance that Rav Chisda said that he washed with bucket loads of water, with handfuls of water, and he was blessed with handfuls of prosperity. And if you're a Rebbeinu B'chaya Kabbalist, you'll say, because one who washes their hands is engaging with the Eser Sfiros, and Eser is related to the word Ashirus, wealth, Aser, B'shvil shetit Asher. You should tithe, you should give meister, you should give a tenth so that you'll become wealthy. But it also means Eser, it means 10, it's the Sfiros. We're getting wealth through the source of, drawing down from the source of all blessings, Hashem. Or there's another great hint that Abu Draham brings in his siddur, which is Al Netilas Yadayim is an acronym for Ayin Nun Yud Ani, poor. So when we actually poor netilas yadayim, then we remove ourselves from poverty. So, Emirat Hashem, everybody should be able to use this shir to help them refocus and pay more attention to netilas yadayim. Learn the halachic as well, because this shir was not about that. But because we wash so often in the day, we can often do it mindlessly. But washing our hands on netilas yadayim is a great opportunity to really refocus, because we daven and we say brachos on our food, but that's all a verbal or a mental state. Netilas yadayim is a physical action, and that's really an opportunity to ground yourself and reflect and meditate that you are doing this because the next thing you're going to do is going to be for the purpose of kedusha and for the purpose of, on a more chassidus level, drawing down the chachma. So you could definitely look in the Tzemach Tzedek's Derech Mechutzecha to find out more about that. That's something that learning all these sources of our netilas yadayim has really gifted me, that it's no longer a bother or a mindless ritual done or something that we try to avoid and say, I just won't eat hamotzi because then I have to wash, but rather it's a privilege because it's a time for reflection and rededication. And after swimming through this whole Yam Shel Talmud and learning some of the Mayim Chayim of Chassidus and really just feeling all the blessings that this water has brought into my life, really, Ein Mayim Ela Tahara. And Tahara is this ultimate water, this life-giving source. And I feel like this shir is a little bit of a window of what learning in a base medrash style can afford women who have the obligation to learn halachas that they need to keep, such as netilas yadayim, and the obligation to understand the meaning behind the mitzvahs that we do and connect us more to the noisen hatara of our mitzvahs. And I really thank Bat Sheva Learning Center for this opportunity. And Emirat Hashem, as we all recommit to the mitzvah of netilas yadayim with greater dedication, we will all earn many brachas for gashmis and for ruchnius, and be able to share these brachas with everyone around and support Talmud Torah for all women and girls.
Before I joined the Chidon, I used to look at the bookshelf full of Sfarim and think, that's not for me. When I opened a Sefer for the first time, my entire self-image changed. I suddenly realized, Torah is something that's available to me, something I can connect to. It opened up a whole new world.
I joined a course with Bat Sheva Learning Center because I wanted to take my learning to the next level. I got to grapple with the text on my own with curiosity, depth, and rigor.
I took responsibility for my own learning. It was life-changing.
Joining the Beis Midrash and being in a room full of women dedicated to investing in their own learning is a transformative experience.
I feel like I'm part of something bigger than myself, preparing for a world whose common language is Tahara.
It starts with a single drop. It ends with the power of an ocean.